Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. When you work as a chef on a cruise ship, you live in a world of routines so precise they could be written into a ship's log. Every morning at 4:30, before the guests even begin to stir, I'm in the galley below Deck 5. The kitchen smells faintly of yeast from the proofing bread. A constant whir of industrial mixers in the background. Stainless steel counters gleam under the fluorescence, and the exhaust hoods hum like distant turbines. I'd been aboard the Aurora of the Seas for nearly 4 months straight. An Oasis-class liner, 360 meters long, displacement just under 230,000 gross tons. She was a floating city, carrying 4,800 passengers and over 2,000 crew. Normally, we'd be hopping ports between Miami, Nassau, and Cozumel, but this voyage was different. No ports, no stops. We'd been anchored off the Florida Straits for weeks, told that global events had temporarily halted docking rights. The captain claimed it was only a matter of waiting for clearance. Life at sea without destinations is strange. Guests wander the decks like restless ghosts, making the casino their second home, or cycling endlessly through the buffet line. My station is near the aft galley, part of the main dining kitchen. The menus still ran on schedule. Breakfast at 6:30, lunch at noon, dinner at 18 o'clock sharp. The illusion of normalcy was as much for us as for the guests. The Aurora was a marvel of engineering. 4 Wärtsilä-Sulzer diesel engines, 2 General Electric gas turbines, and 4 bow thrusters that could spin this mountain of steel like a child's toy. The engine room stretched across 2 decks, a labyrinth of piping, turbines, and control panels with temperature and vibration monitors for each propulsion unit. I'd only been down there twice for safety drills, but the memory of the heat, the smell of lubricant, and the roar of machinery stayed with me. That Monday started quietly enough. The sea was calm, a deep cobalt under a cloudless sky. At breakfast, a few of the regulars took their usual spots. The retired Texan couple who drank black coffee like it was a competition, the British travel writer with his leather notebook, the honeymooners from Argentina who never seemed to stop holding hands. By 9 o'clock, my sous chef, Kamal, originally from Kochi, India, was prepping lunch service when we got the first rumor. One of the waiters, a nervous Filipino kid named Arnel, said he'd been told a guest hadn't returned to their cabin overnight. Security was supposedly doing a quiet check. That sort of thing wasn't unheard of. Drunk passengers sometimes slept on deck chairs or wandered into the wrong rooms. But something about Arnel's face told me this wasn't a routine missing person note. By noon, the rumors grew teeth. 2 more guests, both from the same deck, hadn't shown up for breakfast. The ship's PA system remained silent except for the usual cruise announcements. The captain, Anderson, a tall Swede with a salt and pepper beard, was known for his calm authority. He wasn't the kind to cause panic, but the silence felt heavy. After lunch prep, I took a walk topside for fresh air. The upper decks were bright with sunlight, the infinity pools glittering, steel railings hot to the touch. A few passengers were lounging, but the usual laughter and chatter were muted. I saw our cruise director, a polished Canadian named Lillian, speaking quietly to a security officer by the forward stairwell. They noticed me and cut the conversation short. At 16 o'clock, a call came through the crew channel for non-medical assistance in the crew quarters on Deck 2. Kamal and I exchanged glances. Those calls were rare. I followed a service corridor down, the air growing cooler and more metallic as I descended. Deck 2 was narrow, the ceiling low. Pipes and conduits ran overhead, painted in safety-coded colors: blue for potable water, red for fire mains, yellow for fuel lines. A crowd had gathered near a supply hatch. 2 security officers were blocking the way, their radios hissing with static. I caught a glimpse inside, a cabin door half open, the metal jamb bent inward like it had been struck from the inside. Something dark streaked the wall. My mind told me rust, but it was too fresh, too irregular. That evening, the captain finally addressed the ship. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be limiting passenger movement in certain areas of the vessel. We ask for your cooperation. This is purely a precautionary measure." His tone was calm, but it carried a weight I'd never heard before. By the time I finished dinner service, whispers among the crew had taken on a sharper edge. Someone said a housekeeping worker had been injured below deck. Another claimed there had been a fight between passengers. But the detail that stuck with me came from Arnell. The injured worker had been found in pieces. That night, I couldn't sleep. My cabin was on deck 4, starboard side, no porthole, just the steady vibration of the engines through the steel bulkhead. Around 2 o'clock, I woke to faint thuds somewhere down the corridor. Not footsteps, heavier, irregular, as if something was striking the wall. By morning, 3 more passengers were unaccounted for. We'd all seen cruise ship emergencies on training videos: fires, hull breaches, foodborne outbreaks, but nothing explained what was happening here. When I went to the main galley at 5 o'clock, Kamal was already there, pale and tense. He leaned in close. "They're saying something came up from the engine room," he whispered. "Something?" I asked. He didn't answer. At breakfast, the dining hall was half empty. A security officer stood by each entrance. The British travel writer asked me if the rumors were true. I told him I didn't know, but I think he saw the lie in my eyes. It wasn't until late afternoon that I saw it for myself. I had gone down to deck 3 to retrieve a crate of frozen seafood from storage. The freezer rooms were just forwards of the crew laundry, tight, chilled compartments where frost clung to the steel doors. I'd just unlocked the hatch when I heard it. A slow, wet, dragging sound echoing down the corridor. At first I thought it was a maintenance worker moving supplies, but then I saw the figure turn the corner. It was a man in overalls, one of the engine room crew, I thought, but his posture was wrong. His head hung low, his arms slack, and his steps were jerky, unsteady. His face, there was a slackness to it, his eyes milky and unfocused. His coveralls were torn, and something dark was smeared across his chest. At first, I thought he might have been injured in an accident. Burns, maybe, or a fall. But there was something unnatural about the way he moved. His boots scraped the deck plating with each step, and a faint, wet rasp came from his throat. The air in the corridor felt heavier, the distant hum of the refrigeration compressors the only sound apart from his uneven breathing. I was about 20 feet away when his head jerked sharply to the side like he had heard something no one else could. His nostrils flared, and he let out a noise that didn't sound like any word I'd ever heard. Low, guttural, almost like the sound of a pipe groaning under pressure. Then he started toward me. I took a step back instinctively, my shoulder brushing the freezer door frame. He accelerated in a way that made no sense for someone in that condition. One moment sluggish, the next moving with a sudden burst of energy. I backed into the freezer room, grabbed the heavy steel handle from the inside, and yanked the door shut just as he hit it. The impact reverberated through the thick insulation, followed by a scraping noise as his nails, or fingers, dragged across the metal. Inside the freezer, my breath misted in the air. I could hear the man moving outside, a slow pacing, then the occasional heavy thud against the door. I waited, forcing myself to count the seconds. But after what felt like minutes, the sounds faded down the corridor. My pulse was still hammering when I pushed the door open and stepped out. The corridor was empty, but there was a smear of something dark along the wall where he'd passed. I locked the freezer, grabbed the crate I'd come for, and made my way back toward the service stairwell, my ears straining for any sound behind me. By the time I reached the galley, I was sweating, despite the cold storage run. Kamal looked up from the prep station and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, just set the crate down and went to the hand wash sink, scrubbing my hands longer than necessary. Finally, I told him what I'd seen, but kept my voice low. Too many ears in the room. His expression darkened, and he glanced toward the corridor leading to the crew quarters. The rest of that shift, I couldn't stop replaying the man's face in my mind. The pale, filmed-over eyes. The way his mouth had hung open slightly, as if breathing took deliberate effort. It wasn't exhaustion, and it wasn't drunkenness. It was something else. Something worse. Later that evening, a notice came over the internal crew channel. Engineering section lockdown, no access without clearance. That had never happened before, not even during machinery failures. Rumors flared instantly. Fire in one of the turbine rooms, a ruptured fuel line, a mechanical casualty to one of the Wartzillas. But I didn't believe any of it. Whatever was happening down there wasn't mechanical. The night brought more unsettling signs. On my way to the crew mess after closing down the galley, I passed 2 security officers escorting a steward from Deck 7. His uniform was torn at the sleeve, and his right hand was wrapped in gauze already soaked through. He kept his head down, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. In the mess, conversations were hushed, the clatter of cutlery muted. A few crew members were checking their phones for news, though the satellite link was crawling at best. The global situation that had kept us anchored was still plastered across headlines. Disease outbreaks, quarantines, conflicting reports about coastal cities shutting down. But here, trapped in steel corridors hundreds of nautical miles from the nearest safe port, it all felt closer, more immediate. When I finally turned in for the night, sleep wouldn't come. Every sound from the ventilation ducts made me flinch. At some point I dozed, but I woke to faint shouting echoing up the stairwell. It was too far away to make out words, just the tone, sharp and panicked. Then a single loud metallic bang rang through the deck, followed by silence. The next morning, breakfast service was cut short. At 8:30, Captain Anderson's voice came over the PA, calm but clipped. "All guests are to remain in their cabins until further notice. Crew will provide room service as necessary. This is for your safety and comfort. Thank you for your cooperation." No explanation, no time frame. For us, in the galley, that meant pivoting to large-scale tray prep, stacking meals into insulated carts for delivery. It also meant crew from other departments were now moving food, something normally avoided to keep workflow efficient. I noticed that the delivery routes were being adjusted to bypass certain service corridors entirely. By midday, a rumor reached us that made my skin crawl. One of the engine room workers had been found in a maintenance space near the stern, and 2 security officers had to physically restrain him. The story claimed he had attacked another crew member without provocation. No one could, or would, say where the injured man had been taken. I thought of the man in overalls again. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were fitting together in a way that left no comfort. Something was happening below decks, something spreading. And if the ship was locking down, it meant they thought it could be contained. They were wrong. It was just after 14 o'clock when the first emergency alert sounded. A piercing, triple-tone alarm echoed through the crew areas, followed by the security officer's voice over the intercom. All available personnel to Deck 2 forward. Repeat, all available personnel to Deck 2 forward. The last time I'd heard that tone was during a fire drill, but there was no drill in the schedule. Kamal looked at me, his expression tight. "That's the crew quarters," he said quietly. I followed him, not because I was ordered, but because something told me if I stayed away I'd never know the truth. And ignorance was more dangerous now than whatever waited below. The air in the forward stairwell was warmer, smelling faintly of oil and damp metal. The sound of raised voices grew louder as we descended. When we reached Deck 2, the corridor was chaos. Security officers and Navy windbreakers were trying to clear people back, while 2 crewmen held a cabin door shut from the outside. Something inside was slamming against it, hard enough to make the steel vibrate. One of the officers barked into his radio, but the noise from inside drowned out his words. A wet, animalistic growl, followed by a sharp crack as the door frame began to give. Then it happened. The door burst inward, one of the crewmen falling backward as a figure lunged out. The sight hit me like a physical blow. It was the same man I had seen near the freezer, his coveralls now soaked, his mouth open in a snarl that showed teeth bared like a predator's. His movements were faster now, more deliberate. He hit the closest crewman and drove him to the deck in a single motion. Someone shouted for restraints. Someone else called for medics. But by then it was far too late to treat this like any ordinary emergency. The man moved with a speed and force that didn't match his frame, driving his weight down on the crewman beneath him until the man's head struck the deck with a hollow metallic thud. Blood spread across the gray non-slip flooring, running into the diamond-patterned grooves. 2 security officers tried to pull him off, but the attacker twisted with a jerking violence, flinging one of them against the bulkhead hard enough to dent the thin paneling. The corridor was narrow, barely 2 meters across, and the crush of bodies made it worse. People were stumbling backward, trying to retreat toward the aft stairwell, but every movement slowed those behind them. I pressed against the wall, the smell of oil, sweat, and something metallic thick in the air. It was then I noticed the sound, short, wet gasps from the crewman on deck. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, but his eyes were wide open and fixed, as if the life in him had already gone. The attacker's head snapped toward another security officer, and without hesitation he lunged again. This time, the officer had his baton drawn, but even a full swing across the jaw didn't slow him for more than a heartbeat. The blow should have knocked any normal man down, but this wasn't a normal man anymore. I don't remember deciding to move, but my legs carried me backward toward the junction where the corridor split. Kamal appeared beside me, his face pale and tight. He didn't speak, just grabbed my sleeve and pulled me toward the aft stairwell. Behind us, the noise grew, shouting, boots on metal, the heavy clang of something being dropped, then the unmistakable crack of a handheld taser discharging. The sharp, acrid smell of ozone hit a moment later, carried down the passage by the recycled air. We didn't stop until we reached Deck 3. There, the tension in the air was worse than on Deck 2. Crew members clustered in small groups, talking in low voices, glancing towards the stairwell every time a sound came from below. No one seemed to have a clear picture of what had just happened, but the fragments were enough. Multiple injured, the attacker restrained for now, engineering still sealed, and security attempting to isolate the forward section of Deck 2. Even without official word, it was obvious containment was already failing. The Aurora was a massive ship, but the crew corridors were a network of narrow arteries. Once something, or someone, moved through them, there was no simple way to cut them off without trapping people in the wrong place. Fire doors could be shut, but they required manual control at certain points, and that meant crew had to be physically present in dangerous areas. By late afternoon, passenger restrictions had intensified. Announcements were now telling guests to remain in cabins indefinitely, and meal deliveries were reduced to twice a day. That decision alone told me the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone wanted to admit. Every minute guests stayed locked away was a minute fewer for them to witness what was happening in the crew sections. In the galley, we worked with mechanical precision, producing hundreds of sealed trays in assembly line fashion. The air was hot from the steam tables and dishwashers, but no one complained. There was a silent agreement to keep busy. It left less room for the mind to dwell on the muffled sounds coming from somewhere deep in the hull. More than once I caught someone stopping to listen, head tilted toward the steel walls as if straining to confirm that the distant thumps were real. That night, the silence broke. I had just left the crew mess when the first alarm blared, a continuous tone that echoed harshly through the service corridors. This wasn't the triple tone for fires or medical emergencies. This was the general alert, the one you never wanted to hear at sea unless the ship itself was in danger. The PA crackled to life with the chief security officer's voice, sharp and urgent. All security teams to midship passenger decks. Repeat, midship passenger decks. The words hit harder than the alarm itself. The infected, or whatever they were, had crossed into passenger areas. I moved with the flow of crew heading toward the central stairwell, but halfway there, the direction of movement changed. People started pushing back against us, faces tight with fear, muttering about an incident on Deck 6. The movement became a surge when someone shouted that the stairwell ahead was compromised. That was the word they used, compromised, as if speaking plainly would make it more real. Kamal grabbed my shoulder and steered me toward a maintenance access point. The narrow ladder well was cramped, smelling of dust and lubricants from the pipework that ran alongside it. We climbed up 2 decks and emerged into a service pantry near the portside dining room. The lights were still on, the polished wood and brass gleaming, but the room was empty. A tray cart lay overturned, plates and cutlery scattered across the carpeted floor. From somewhere beyond the dining room came the sound of movement. Not footsteps, but something heavier dragging along the floor. Then a sharp crash, followed by a scream that cut off so suddenly it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. We didn't investigate. We crossed to the starboard side, slipping into another crew passage, and started making our way aft. The ship felt different now. The usual vibration from the engines was uneven, like one of the big diesels had been taken offline. The air circulation was still running, but there was a faint burnt smell underneath the usual galley aromas, a smell I had learned to associate with overloaded electrical systems. By the time we reached the aft service stairwell, a security officer was already there, red-faced and breathing hard. He ordered us to stay put and not go any farther aft. Something in his tone told me it wasn't a suggestion. We retreated a few meters back into the passage, just far enough that we couldn't see the stairwell but could still hear what was happening. The first sound was the metallic clang of a fire door slamming shut. The second was pounding on that same door, loud enough to rattle it in its frame. The pounding grew, each impact shaking dust from the seams in the overhead piping. Then came the voices, multiple, overlapping, but all wrong. They were human in pitch, but stripped of normal rhythm, like language reduced to a series of broken sounds. That was the moment I understood we were dealing with something far beyond a medical emergency or a violent crewman. It wasn't confined to the engineering section anymore. It was spreading through the ship like water through a breached hull, filling every space it could find. The captain's voice finally came over the PA again, but this time there was no attempt to keep calm. All crew, prepare to initiate evacuation procedures. Lifeboat teams to stations immediately. The words seemed to hit the ship itself, Conversations in the passageways stopped, footsteps quickened, and the low hum of normal operations was replaced by the sharp clatter of lockers opening and equipment being pulled free. Every crew member had practiced evacuation drills dozens of times, but drills were orderly, controlled affairs. This was different from the first step. I moved with Kamal toward our assigned lifeboat station on Deck 5, portside. The service stairwell was already congested with crew climbing from lower decks, some still in work aprons, others carrying small duffels or nothing at all. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied, a reminder that the ship's power systems were being stressed by something deeper inside her hull. The smell of the air was changing too, less like the sea, more like hot metal and something organic that didn't belong. By the time we reached Deck 5, the corridor outside the embarkation doors was a bottleneck. Crew in life jackets were lining passengers up in groups, checking manifest lists. Even here, far from the forward decks where the outbreak had started, I could see panic eroding the procedure. Passengers were demanding to know why they couldn't return to their cabins for belongings. Some were trying to push forward out of turn, convinced they'd be left behind. The practiced calm of the crew was starting to fray under the strain. I caught sight of the ship's safety officer, a tall Greek named Michaelis, trying to coordinate the launch order. His radio crackled with overlapping calls, requests for medical assistance on Deck 7, reports of movement near the aft stairwell, confirmation that 2 lifeboat davits had already been rendered unusable. That last detail sent a chill through me. On a ship the size of the Aurora, every lifeboat mattered. Each one could carry about 370 people. Losing even 2 meant hundreds of lives with nowhere to go but the water. Somewhere forward, a muffled thud echoed through the steel, followed by a distant scream. It was impossible to tell if it was from a passenger or crew. Then came another sound. Heavy impacts on the deck above us, like furniture being thrown or large bodies hitting the floor. Michaelis swore under his breath and ordered the portside lifeboat crews to start boarding immediately. Manifest order be damned. The moment the first embarkation door opened, the sea air rushed in, cool and sharp against the heat of the crowded corridor. Outside, the water was calm under a gray sky, but the sight of the lifeboats swinging on their davits, orange hulls gleaming, drove home the reality. The Aurora of the seas was no longer a safe place. The first group was ushered out, crew guiding them into the lifeboat's enclosed cabin. The hydraulic whine of the davits lowering them over the side was almost comforting, a mechanical certainty in the chaos. But that comfort didn't last. From the aft end of the corridor came a sharp clatter of metal, followed by shouts that turned quickly into screams. I turned just in time to see the first infected appear, 2 of them, both crew, uniforms stained and torn. Their movements were jerky but fast, arms out, eyes fixed on the nearest cluster of people. The crowd reacted instantly, shoving toward the open embarkation door, pushing those already boarding into the lifeboat's entrance. The orderly process collapsed into raw survival. Security tried to form a line, batons raised, but it was like watching a sandbank hold back a rising tide. One of the infected slammed into a guard with enough force to drive him back into the bulkhead. Another broke past entirely, vanishing into the mass of panicked passengers. The sound that followed was a mix of shouting, the hollow thump of bodies colliding, and the desperate whine of the lifeboat's hydraulic arms still lowering in motion. Kamal grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the secondary embarkation point further forward. The corridor between us and that door was narrower, lined with storage lockers and emergency gear. The lighting flickered again, plunging us into half-shadow for a heartbeat before returning. In that moment of darkness, I thought I heard something scraping along the deck plating ahead. When the light steadied, there was nothing visible. But the corridor no longer felt empty. We kept moving, feet hitting the non-slip flooring in rapid, deliberate steps. Ahead, the second embarkation team was already loading passengers, their voices raised to keep order. They didn't yet know the aft position was compromised. Michaelis's voice came over the radio of the nearest lifeboat crewman, urgent and clipped. "Seal the aft door. I repeat, seal the aft embarkation door. Deck 5 is breached." The crewman's head snapped toward us as if realizing for the first time what that meant. We were among the last to board that lifeboat before the door was pulled shut. Inside, the cabin smelled of oil, damp fabric, and the press of too many bodies. The seats were molded plastic benches, the air thick and hot without the ventilation system running yet. Through the small forward window, I could see the massive white flank of the Aurora looming above us. The lowering began with a jolt. The view tilted upward as we descended toward the waterline. Then a shadow moved across the window, something leaning over the embarkation door above. It wasn't until we were halfway down that I saw it clearly, one of the infected, clinging to the outer railing, head turning toward us with that same unnatural jerk. It didn't matter how far we lowered, there was no going back up. The lifeboat hit the water with a shudder, the crew inside moving quickly to release the hooks from the davits. The engine roared to life, vibrating through the hull, and we began to pull away from the ship's side. From the water, the Aurora looked impossibly huge, her decks lined with lifeboats in various stages of launching. On the upper decks, small dark shapes moved among the white railings, too fast and erratic to be normal passengers. We had escaped the ship, but not the outbreak. The radio crackled again, voices overlapping, reports from other lifeboats that they'd launched short of capacity because they were coming down the stairs, or something got into the lounge. There were still thousands of people aboard, and the water around us was empty except for a scattering of boats heading in all directions, no rendezvous point given. As the Aurora of the seas receded into the haze, the reality set in, without a port willing to take us, and with whatever had started there now free in the lifeboats. This wasn't rescue. It was only the next stage. The lifeboat's small diesel engine droned steadily, the sound vibrating through the thin hull, a constant reminder of how little stood between us and the open ocean. The enclosed lifeboat was designed for survival, not comfort. Orange fiberglass walls curved overhead, broken only by narrow, reinforced windows. Bench seating lined both sides, padded just enough to prevent injury during rough handling. The air was hot and close despite the vents, and already beads of sweat were rolling down faces. People were breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the panic still riding them. There were 32 of us inside, crew and passengers mixed. Kamal sat opposite me, his knees pressed tight together, hands clasped as if trying to keep them from shaking. At the forward end, 2 deckhands in life jackets worked the navigation panel, a compact console with a GPS unit, VHF marine radio, and a small radar display. The GPS screen showed a scattering of blips around us, other lifeboats, but no fixed destination plotted. Within the first half hour, it became obvious no one had a real plan. The crewman at the radio was trying to reach the other boats, switching between channels, but the responses were fragmented. Some lifeboats reported mechanical issues, others said they were holding position in hopes of regrouping, and at least one admitted they'd cut radio contact after hearing strange noises aboard another boat. The Aurora was now barely a silhouette on the horizon, but even from this distance I could see her slowing. A faint smear of smoke rose from somewhere aft, mingling with the pale sky. I wondered how many were still trapped inside if the infection had reached the bridge. if the ship would simply drift until she became another ghost of the sea. Our own situation worsened quickly. Supplies aboard the lifeboat were limited. Sealed rations, water containers, first aid kits. Enough for several days if rationed strictly, but far less if panic drove people to overuse them. The deckhands insisted we'd maintain a slow course west toward the Florida coast, but admitted they had no confirmation any port would accept us. The global situation, the reason we'd been anchored so long, was still out there, and whatever had consumed the Aurora would only make authorities less willing to let us dock. The first sign of trouble came from the stern compartment. One of the passengers, a heavy-set man in a Hawaiian shirt, had been sitting slumped since we launched. At first, people thought it was seasickness. The enclosed lifeboats were notorious for it. But when a crewman tried to get him to sip water, the man barely reacted. His skin was gray under the fluorescent lights, and his breathing shallow but rapid. Someone mentioned he'd been injured during the boarding rush, maybe trampled, maybe bitten. The word hung in the air for a moment before anyone realized the weight of it. The deckhands exchanged looks, then moved the man toward the aftmost bench, away from the rest. No one openly protested, but the way people shifted their feet and avoided looking at him spoke volumes. The heat inside the boat made the air feel thicker, each breath tasting faintly of oil and salt. The injured man's breathing grew louder in that close space, and I could see the unease settling over everyone. Outside, the sea remained calm, but the lifeboats around us were drifting apart. Some were keeping pace with us, others had fallen behind or angled off in different directions. With no central coordination, we were becoming scattered specks in an endless expanse. The horizon felt impossibly far, and the sky had that flat, washed-out tone that made it hard to judge time. Hours passed. We switched to hand steering to save fuel, but that only deepened the sense of being adrift. The injured man at the stern began to twitch in short, sharp motions, his head lolling forward before jerking upright. One of the passengers suggested we get him out, but the deckhands shut the idea down immediately. Removing someone into open water wasn't something they were willing to do yet. Night fell slowly, the light bleeding out of the sky until we were left in darkness, except for the lifeboat's dim interior lamps. The sea was quiet, but in that silence, every sound inside the boat seemed amplified. The creak of the hull as it shifted in the swell, the drip of condensation from the ceiling, the steady rasp of the injured man's breathing, now joined by an occasional low groan. It happened just after midnight. I'd been half dozing, head against the wall, when a sudden thud jolted everyone awake. The man in the Hawaiian shirt was no longer slumped. He was upright, eyes wide, pupils clouded. His mouth worked in small jerking motions, and a thin, wet sound came from deep in his throat. The nearest passenger recoiled, pressing back against the opposite bench. One of the deckhands moved forward cautiously, but the man reacted with shocking speed, lunging across the narrow aisle. The confined space turned the boat into chaos instantly. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to put distance between yourself and him. People were scrambling over benches, pressing against the walls, shouting for help. The deckhand managed to grapple with him, forcing him down against the deck plating. It took both crewmen to restrain him long enough to bind his wrists with a length of mooring line. His legs kicked violently, striking the benches hard enough to jar those sitting there. The sound of his teeth snapping shut echoed in the cramped cabin, a sound that cut through every other noise. When they finally had him restrained, the crew dragged him toward the small forward storage compartment and locked it from the outside. His muffled growls continued, vibrating through the thin wall. No one spoke for a long while after that. The truth was undeniable now. Whatever had taken the Aurora was with us, here, on this lifeboat in the middle of open water. The rain started not long after we locked him inside, a steady cold drizzle that blurred the horizon and turned the lifeboat's deck slick under our feet. Every shift in the swell made the hull creak, a sound that carried uncomfortably well in the cramped space. I could hear him still behind the steel door, low, guttural sounds that came in irregular bursts, sometimes followed by the thump of his shoulder or head against the bulkhead. A few of the passengers were whispering in the forward section, but most kept their eyes down, gripping the edges of the benches like they were afraid the sea might suddenly throw them overboard. The bosun, a tall Filipino named Reyes, who had served on the Aurora for nearly 20 years, sat across from me, his yellow rain jacket dripping steadily onto the metal decking. His eyes were fixed on the storage compartment door. "That thing's not going to stop him if he decides to push," he muttered, not really to anyone. No one responded. The truth was, we all knew the door was meant to keep fishing gear and emergency rations in, not a grown man in whatever state he was in now. I kept thinking back to the galley, to the moment his face lifted just enough for me to see his eyes. There had been nothing there, no recognition, no fear, just hunger. And the memory made my stomach churn worse than the swell. We had no medical supplies for this kind of problem. No guidance. The captain's orders had been clear: abandon ship, maintain radio silence unless otherwise directed, and await further instruction from company command. But if company command had already lost the Aurora, then who exactly was going to give us those instructions? By nightfall, the wind picked up, and the lifeboat rode the waves like a cork. The smell of diesel from the small auxiliary engine mixed with salt spray and the damp scent of too many bodies crammed into too small a space. People shifted constantly, trying to find comfort where there was none. At some point, Reyes approached the compartment again, this time with one of the deckhands, a younger guy named Miller. They had a length of nylon rope, and I realized they were adding a secondary lash across the door's handle. Insurance, in case the simple latch failed. That night, no one truly slept. The sound from inside the compartment didn't stop, it only changed. Less pounding now, more scratching, like fingernails against metal. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. A few passengers moved further forward in the boat, pretending it was because they wanted to be closer to the bow, but I saw the way they kept glancing back. At dawn, the rain had cleared, but the sea had turned a deep, endless blue, flat under a pale sky. Reyes passed out ration bars from a sealed box and gave everyone a half bottle of water. "We've got 2 weeks at this rate," he told me quietly, "if nothing goes wrong." But something was already wrong, and we both knew it. Just before midday, the scratching stopped. At first, the silence was a relief, until I noticed the others had fallen just as quiet. We were all waiting. Miller finally stepped forward, pressed his ear to the compartment door, then jerked back like it had burned him. His face was pale. "He's not making any sound," he said. Reyes and I exchanged a look. He unhooked the secondary lash but left the latch itself alone. "We're not opening it," he said. "Not unless we have no choice." But the problem with being adrift at sea is that no choice has a way of arriving faster than you expect. By late afternoon, a faint plume appeared on the horizon, a smudge of gray smoke. At first, we thought it might be land, but as we drew nearer, the outline of another vessel began to emerge. Smaller than the Aurora, more like a coastal ferry, listing slightly to one side. No lights, no movement. The captain of our lifeboat, a senior officer named Patel, brought us closer, circling wide at first, scanning the decks. Chairs and tables were scattered across the aft section, ropes dangling into the water. A lifeboat on the starboard side was missing entirely. Patel cut the engine and let us drift alongside, the hulls bumping gently. "Might be supplies," he said. "Fuel, food, water." Reyes didn't look convinced. "Or might be like the Aurora," he said. "But in the end, hunger and thirst are persuasive arguments." We tied off, and Patel picked 4 volunteers to board. Reyes went. Miller went. A passenger named Carmen, who said she'd worked as a nurse in Puerto Rico, insisted on going too. And me, because I couldn't stomach the thought of sitting in that boat listening to whatever was or wasn't moving in the compartment behind us while the others took the risk. The ferry's deck was slick, the paint worn through to bare metal in places. Inside, the air was stale and warm, with a faint coppery tang that made my throat tighten. We moved in single file, checking cabins and lounges. At first, nothing. Then, from the forward salon, we heard it. A dragging sound, slow and irregular. Reyes raised a fire axe he'd taken from the lifeboat, his knuckles white on the handle. We rounded the corner and saw them. 3 of them. Not passengers anymore. Not really people anymore. And as soon as they saw us, they began to move. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.